This is Walt Disney World Today. Give us 5 minutes and we'll give you the world.
It's Friday, October 14th, 2005, and this is episode number 10 for Walt Disney World Today. I'm your host, Matt Hochberg from mgmstudios.org, and here with us for this show is Mike Scopa from mouseplanet.com. Welcome, Mike.
How you doing, Matt?
Pretty good. And Len Testa would be here, but he's suffering, I think, from divine intervention because he has no power right now. So it's just going to be me and Mike today, which is a step up from last show when it was just me. So we're slowly getting up there. One by one, we'll have everybody back. Today we're going to be talking about the upcoming Osborne Lights Spectacle of Lights that will be opening November 14th, 2005, which is just 1 month from this podcast recording. The lights will run through January 8th, 2006. And let's first explain to our listeners what is the Osborne Lights and why is it at Disney World?
Well, Matt, I can tell you that I think it was early 90s that Jennings Osborne, who I know that he was a businessman. I think he worked in the automotive industry. He put some lights together and decorated his house in the early 90s to try to cheer up his daughter. I think his daughter's name was Breezy. She was going through some kind of depression. And he decided to put some lights up. And that really cheered her up. And as the years went on, he added more and more lights. Pretty soon, he ran out of space on his house, and from what I understand, he purchased the house on either side of his original house, and he started putting lights on those houses. I guess he kind of got carried away, and his neighbors started to complain. And from what I understand, there was a dealing with the Arkansas Supreme Court, and in 1994, they declared that his lights were a public nuisance, and so that really put a damper on it. And I guess Disney heard about it, and in 1995, they asked him to bring his Spectacle of Lights to the MGM Studios theme park, and the Osborne Spectacle of Lights was born. I believe the first time that he had his lights at MGM, I think he started off with 4 million lights, and I believe now it's 5, maybe even as much as 7 million lights. Yeah,
there's 5 million individual lights, and that equates to about 350 miles of it.
350 miles? Wow.
Yeah, there's I got all sorts of impressive stats. There are 350 miles of lights with 32.2 miles of extension cables.
Did you also know that it also includes 66 snow machines?
Yes.
And for those of you who are Hidden Mickey fans, there are 43 Hidden Mickeys in and around the Osborne Spectacle of Lights. So if you happen to be fortunate enough to visit the Osborne Lights this year, look for the Hidden Mickeys. Supposedly there are 43 Hidden Mickeys.
And you mentioned, by the way, that they are at the Disney MGM Studios, which I failed to mention in the beginning of the show. So it's important to know that that's where it's at.
We should probably mention where exactly they are too.
Yes,
go ahead, Matt.
Okay, the lights are actually located on what was formerly known as New York Street. I believe now it's called Streets of America, and that's located towards the back of the park. You probably know where it is if you've ever gone to the new Lights, Motors, Action Stunt Show. It's right back over there. Now, for people who've been there, who've seen the Osborne Lights in the past, perhaps back in the 90s or around 2000, you may have remembered them being on a residential street area where the Golden Girls house was and all of that. However, since then, residential street was knocked down to make room for the stunt show, and so now it's just on New York Street. And, well, Mike, there were some complaints last year and the year before that. In 2003, actually, there were no lights because of the construction.
That's correct.
And last year, there were a lot of complaints. What complaints did you hear about them? I know I've heard about specific complaints.
Well, I can tell you that I was one of those who was making the complaints. The problem with the lights last year was that they were so condensed, they were so packed, that the individual displays that really, really are very, very nice were lost because they were crowded by the other displays. There were so many lights compacted in such a small area that the individual displays could not stand alone, and you could not appreciate them. Also, they were just lined up differently than they were originally planned to be lined up. For instance, there is a light display of Mickey driving a train, and it actually had to go around a corner, and the train display just wasn't built for a 90-degree turn. That was one of the reasons that people were complaining. I also recall that it was very, very, very crowded, and people were walking through, and they were hustled about, and they did not get a good chance to really look at the lights if they wanted to see the lights. The only part of the lights that really was enjoyable was where they hang the angels, which is just in front of the Lights Motor Action stadium. That, I believe, was the same as it has always been. And last week when I was down there, I noticed that they had put up the angels there as well, and they actually were probably about 95% complete with their lights this year. But it looks as though it's going to be very much like it was last year. So we'll wait and see.
Yeah, and we should mention to our listeners that if you had originally planned your trip perhaps earlier in the year, that the dates for the Osborne Lights has in fact changed. They were originally supposed to be later in November, and now they're being shown. The first night is November 14th. So perhaps you were planning on seeing them later on because your trip was going to span, I don't know, maybe perhaps closer to Thanksgiving. Well, now you don't have to wait as long. Or if perhaps your trip was earlier in the month and you didn't figure you would have the opportunity to see them, now you should perhaps reconsider your plans and work them into it. I also heard a lot of what you said, Mike. I think what a lot of people found was one of the interesting things about Residential Street was that the lights on Residential Street, where the Golden Girls house was and all of that, gave that sort of that feeling of being, in a real residential area, kind of like seeing the lights in your own little neighborhood. And it didn't seem like you were at Disney World for that, few minutes that you were walking through there.
That's correct. I think that the difference also was that like you said, it was a suburban or a residential feel to it, whereas last year it was very, very, very urban-like, and it just didn't come across as warm and fuzzy as it had been in previous years. I don't know if we'll ever see a return to some kind of a residential setting for these lights, but I know it's not going to happen this year, although I would really like to see them at least cut down a little bit so we don't get that, what is that movie with Chevy Chase?
Oh, I was just thinking of that, actually.
We don't want a National Lampoon. Yeah, yep. We don't want a National Lampoon vision like we got last year.
Sure, certainly. Well, for people going there, let's give them some tips on how to best see it. The area where you line up is on Commissary Lane, which is the street that's it's behind the Sorcerer's Hat at the studios, and it's kind of it's the same street where you'll find ABC Commissary, the Sci-Fi, and you'll see a huge crowd lining up there. And you line up there, and now when you should go see the actual lights, you should probably avoid the weekends, since a lot of the locals tend to show up for the weekends.
Right.
And after Thanksgiving weekend to the week before Christmas is probably your least crowded time, as it's going to be the least crowded in the parks to begin with. And during Thanksgiving and during that Christmas week, you're just going to have a real... the parks are going to be swamped to begin with, never mind the lights. So if you can see them during... not, avoiding those weekends, that'd be your best bet. Do you have any other timing tips, Mike?
Well, I'd like to add one more thing. If possible, I would try to visit the Osborne Lights when there is a Phantasmic performance going on. That would cut down the that would cut down on the crowd as well, because after that performance, everybody will leave the Phantasmic Theater and go right over to the Osborne Lights. That's
a great tip. The lights do go on at 6 o'clock. However, Disney does tell you that you can see Phantasmic and lights in the same night. However, they tend to put the Phantasmic showing earlier, so a lot of folks go to Phantasmic, like Mike said, and then they go and see the lights afterwards. Now, if you have no choice, perhaps you're on a short trip, or it just works out, you've got one night at MGM and you've got to see Phantasmic as well as the lights in the same night, I would probably, to beat the crowds, after Phantasmic is done, I would sit back, let everyone else go ahead of you, and try to be really at the end of the whole mass exodus to the lights. Because if you try to compete with everyone else there, you're just going to be really uncomfortable, and you're not going to have the most opportune time to see the lights when you've got a couple thousand other people with you right there. Now, when you're actually viewing the lights, you should also again wait about 30 minutes after it opens. So if it opens at 6, wait until about 6:30 or so, because there's always going to be a bunch of people who line up to go see the lights. So if you can wait 30 minutes, let that initial crowd kind of go through, you'll have a lot better because you'll be able to move at your own pace, which is especially hard to move at your own pace if you're in a group and you're trying to compete with a huge crowd. And again, going back to Mike's tip, if you can avoid avoid Fantasmic and go to the lights during Fantasmic, that would be a great strategy to implore. Any other tips you got, Mike?
Well, it's too bad that Len isn't here because he would probably be able to tell us which day of the week MGM usually sees the highest crowds. And I think, I think that it's I think it's Tuesday. So I would avoid Tuesday.
Okay, so avoid the weekends, avoid Tuesdays, and now, of course, if you're going to be stuck, a lot of people I know can only take off during one time of the year, and that's during Thanksgiving, or perhaps it's during Christmas week. And really, if you find yourself that you have no choice, really, then you're just going to have to you're going to have to deal with the huge crowds that are going to be there, not only at the lights, but everywhere in Walt Disney World during that time. And again, your best bet is to avoid the initial rush, because a lot of people, the lights go on at 6 o'clock, okay, good, we're going to go see the lights at 6 o'clock. So if you can avoid it a little bit, let the initial rush go in, you'll find that it's a little bit better in terms of seeing it. What about pictures, Mike? Do you have any tips for taking pictures of the lights?
Well, I can tell you that you don't want to take the picture of the Halloween cat that's in the inside one of the buildings. That's one thing that I don't like. And there's also a flying saucer display. As far as pictures go, that was one of the problems last year because, like I had mentioned before, the displays were very close to one another, and in fact, they were behind. There was one display with Mickey shaking hands with Santa Claus, and right behind that display was another display. So when you took the photo, you really could not distinguish between the two. So that was a problem. The only place that was really good for taking photos was in that center of town near the Lights Motor Action stunt show, and you could take very nice pictures of the angels, and you could also take very nice pictures of those displays that were on top of the buildings. But that's about as far as I could see for taking really, really good photos.
Yeah, and we should also mention last year they didn't have those nifty little 3D glasses to watch to look at the lights, and
right.
This year the glasses will be back, so be sure to grab a pair on your way in. And they have you used the glasses in the past, Mike?
No, I never did.
Okay, it kind of makes it gives it a different feeling to it. It's not going to make it feel like Muppet Vision 3D where everything kind of sticks out at you, but it gives the lights a little bit of an interesting look to them rather than just looking at them usually. And I also have on my own site, I've got a bunch of tips for still film cameras and video cameras, none of which are very interesting to mention on the podcast. However, I will put a link to them in today's show notes so that you can take a look at it if you're interested in videotaping or perhaps taking still pictures. Any last-minute tips for our listeners, or have we kind of talked about it all?
I think that we've pretty much covered it, Matt. I think that it's very important to once again mention that it can be really crowded, and they have to really think about when would be the best time for them to go over there and spend some time watching, looking at the lights, and always keeping in mind that if there are two Fantasmic shows, I would go to the Osborne lights during the second show. I don't know if there will be any nights during the time that the Spectacle of Lights is operating that there will be two Fantasmic shows, possibly during the week of Christmas. But if that ever happens, then I would definitely opt to go to the Osborne lights during the second Fantasmic show, when there's even fewer people in the park.
Yep. Ideally, I think most folks, I think you'd agree with me, Mike, that if you can pick 2 nights, one night see Fantasmic and one night to see the lights.
Yes, if you can do that.
Yep.
If you can do that.
Okay. Well, Mike, that's it for us today. This has been episode number 10. Actually, I started saying the conclusion, Mike, and I forgot to tell our listeners about our new call-in feature that we're going to be featuring. We're going to start, because of the great success of last week's show where we did a call for help show, we've been getting still lots of emails from people, and we want to address them. So we're going to be adding actually a third show to our lineup. Now, right now we have shows on Mondays and Fridays of every week, but we're actually going to be adding a show on Wednesday. Now, the Wednesday show is going to be purely just answering your listener questions. So we do have a few questions left over from the last call for help show, but we'd like your questions all the time. So please send us all your questions, trip planning questions, where to go to eat, what we think of a particular attraction, whatever it may be. We love answering them. So send them to questions at wdwtoday.com. I'll put a link again in the show notes for it. In fact, you'll be able to use an interactive form in case you don't have email available wherever you are. And send in your questions. And we have a nice little dungeon area where Mike and Len sit and they answer the questions for you. And hopefully we'll be able to feature your question on the show. Again, this has been episode number 10 of Walt Disney World Today. Be sure to visit the Walt Disney World Today website at www.wdwtoday.com for all the show notes, as well as the ability to send us all your comments about this podcast. And again, please be sure to send us all your questions to questions at wdwtoday.com. As always, you can look for our new shows on Mondays and Fridays and starting next week, Wednesdays of every week. For Len Testa, Mike Scopa, and Mike Newell, I'm Matt Hochberg. We'll see you next show.